Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you hit the grades of your dreams at school, college, and university through the science of fast learning and lasting memory, the psychology of study productivity, and the secrets to great exam technique. And now your host, the Cambridge University trained psychologist who's dedicated his life to helping students study better and outsmart their exams, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome back to the Exam Study Expert Podcast. It's my great pleasure today to introduce you to Laura Attridge, who will be helping us round up the When I Grow Up season with a more creative note, talking about steering your way into careers in performing arts. In her case, that means writing and directing operas. Hers is a fascinating story, and on the way we touch on a whole range of handy topics like overcoming fear, getting stuff done, and systems for managing your diary and staying productive. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure. I think it's probably helpful just to start by giving a brief introduction to what you're doing with your life now.
So I am about 4.5 years into being a freelance director and writer and workshop leader, in primarily working in opera, also doing a bit of theatre and interdisciplinary work.
And that sounds amazing. I know there's no such thing as a typical day, but maybe paint me a picture of a sort of typical week in the life of what sort of things you find yourself doing.
That's still a difficult question to answer because I work practically on a contract-to-contract basis. So I will go from the extremes of being in a very intense, say, 6-week rehearsal period where every day is a 9 to 5, as it were, in my terms, of rehearsal during the day and then writing up notes and prep in the evening. So that might go on for sort of 6 weeks. I might be away from home, staying elsewhere until opening night. Or like I am at the moment, I'm juggling several things. So I'm running some education workshops. So I'm up and down from London and the locations where the workshops are being held. In the meantime, I'm having meetings, I'm setting up projects, I'm having interviews, I'm working with composers to develop ideas for new operas. And I'm trying to fit in lots of things in between those big rehearsal periods of the projects that sort of make up the big blocks in my year that I then work around to try and fit everything in. So at the moment, my week is made up of workshops maybe for sort of half the day. And then, for example, I just spent a whole weekend in auditions for a production I'm directing later this year. And then the rest of the time, writing applications, having meetings, talking to people, making connections.
And that sounds amazing and nuts and also huge fun. What would be great to do is perhaps go right back to the beginning and we can kind of figure out how you got there. What was the first memory that you have of what you wanted to be when you grow up?
I wanted to be an opera singer, and I wanted to be an opera singer from a very early age. And that stayed with me for a long time. That stayed with me for 25 years, probably until I had the chance to actually have a go at training at being an opera singer. So it's been quite a journey.
For sure. That obviously started to evolve at some point. Did that influence what you were thinking of studying, perhaps at university?
It did. It was something that I suppose once I'd established that dream very early on, at a very early age, I had at different places in my mind, whether that was at the forefront and that was something that was motivating me, or whether that was something at the back that was only there if someone says, "Oh, what do you want to do when you graduate or when you grow up?" Or however old I was, it would be my stock response. It would be, "I want to be an opera singer." So it wasn't always something that I was consciously thinking about. It was just always, one day I'm going to be an opera singer. That's my dream. And that was there all throughout school when I was obviously working academically, as well as, I can tell you more about this later, but sort of extracurricular activities. I was performing, I was writing, I was directing. And when I got to thinking about university, I had a big decision to make, because that was the first time I had to think, okay, am I going to go and do this now? Is this definitely what I want to do? If it is what I want to do, is the best thing for me to do to go and study that at conservatoire now? So there were sort of two strands to it, really. One was, is it what I want to do? And the other was, if so, should I go and do that immediately aged? Well, I finished school when I was still 17. So I was pretty young. And I made my decision in terms of my undergraduate degree based on both of those factors. I think one was that I luckily thought, I don't think I can decide now. I'm only 17, or I've just turned 18 in the summer after I did my A-levels. The other reasons were sort of multifold. One very practical thing was I got lots of advice and felt that because the voice is something unlike, for example, an instrument outside of the body that you can practice for hours and hours a day, and you don't have to wait for your body to sort of catch up and develop muscles and do certain things that you do when you're an opera singer. I wanted to go and do something else academic while I was letting my body and myself, because people take time to develop as well, just have a bit more time. And I'd keep having singing lessons, I'd keep performing, and I'd keep all that going. And then I would decide, once I'd done an undergraduate degree, A, if it's still what I wanted to do, having had a bit more perspective, and B, whether I really thought I was still vocally good enough. So that was plan A, was to go do academic undergrad and then think again about conservatoire at the end of that time. So I ended up going and having a gorgeous, wonderful, brilliant, inspiring 3 years at Newcastle University doing English literature.
I mean, it sounds like you had a lot of interest outside of the classroom.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting looking back now at the age of 30, nearly 5 years into what I consider as my long-term career, to see all of the things that I wasn't able to see at the time, back at school, back at university, that really told me what I should be doing with my life, or what I could be doing with my life. And I think that key to my success as a freelancer who's now juggling a lot of different projects and managing my own diary and being proactive really must have started at school, when I was juggling a diary of academic and extracurricular activities. Because I was always a very dedicated student. I was motivated to keep up with everything and keep everything at a very high standard because I was doing so much.
Any advice for how to manage that, how to get the balance right?
So I would say to anybody at any level, however young, experiencing a busy schedule, work as hard on having rest time and having time for yourself, because that's something that I'm still discovering. It's very easy to pack everything in and then burn out or feel exhausted or overwhelmed. It certainly happened to me in my third year of university. About halfway through, I had taken on too much. So start practicing and thinking about that now, and self-care. I think that's really important. And I say that as somebody who hasn't quite figured it out yet. But the earlier you start thinking about that as something that's as important as work, I think the better. On the organizational side, I would say come up with your own strategies, try different strategies of how you manage your diary. I prefer, for example, to keep a paper diary rather than an electronic diary, which frustrates many people who are trying to sync their diaries with me and they can't, because I just don't do that. So, for example, I have learned that I work visually, so I like to have a 2-page spread of the whole week so that I can see in chunks of time what I'm doing. When I'm doing it, I color code it as well, because I'm a massive geek. And I like to have a page, so I have a page in between each of the diary weeks that has notes, so I can write in shorthand, and then I can flip over to a page of notes which might have my train reservation code, which might have the address of where I'm meeting somebody for a meeting. So I like to keep everything in there, including birthdays and personal things. I also I'm a big fan of a to-do list, and I've discovered that a to-do list that has everything on it is incredibly overwhelming. It has short-term things, urgent things, long-term projects that you kind of want to do at some point you don't want to forget about but aren't urgent. These days, I'm trialing a to-do list system, which I think is working, where I have a master to-do list which has everything on it. If I think of something and I think, I should do that at some point, I write it down. And then I have an ongoing weekly to-do list where I actually schedule what I have to do per day. So I look at my diary a week ahead and I say, I know on that Monday, I'm going to have probably about 2 hours to get stuff done, in which case these are my priorities for that Monday. And when I've done those things, this is my attempt at getting some rest. When I've done those things, I stop. I don't go, what's on the calendar for Tuesday?
Yeah.
I stop. Well, that's the theory, at least.
You're taking on manageable amounts each day, each week, making sure you build in that time to look after yourself too.
Absolutely.
So tell me about your university days. What are your kind of memories in terms of how you chose to spend your time on your course versus extracurricular activities and nurturing those talents?
I suppose thinking academically, there are two things I think I would mention as as things that I'm really, really pleased that I did, approaches that I took, that I hope might be helpful for your listeners. One, and I know this is not right for everybody, but I took a gap year. And I'll tell you for why. I took a gap year because, again, I think because of this mindset I had about getting perspective and making decisions based on that, rather than just staying in the machine and going and doing the thing I should be doing next. I should be continuing my studies. But the brilliant thing I did in my gap year, as someone going on to study English literature, was to read everything I wanted to read while I was doing my A-levels and my GCSEs, and I just didn't have time or energy to read broadly outside of my syllabus. And I kept a reading diary. I mean, I read, and I read very quickly, which is very useful, but I read so many books that I've been meaning to read or wanting to read. I read for pleasure, I read for academic interest. And I turned up, and in the first few weeks at university, I could look around a seminar room, and based on people's attitudes in the seminar room, I could sort of 90% accuracy say gap year, no gap year, gap year, no gap year, gap year, no gap year. I could tell who had come straight from A-levels and was still plugged into that attitude of this is how learning works. And I could tell that there were people who'd gone out and experienced something else, whatever that was, whether that was working in a bookshop, whether that was traveling the world, whether that was like me, reading all the books you ever wanted to read. There was a perspective and a maturity there about their approach to their studies, simply added by just to have a bit more time. That evened out by third year. I couldn't have told you in third year, but for at least the first term, it was pretty evident, and I think very helpful to people like me who needed that time. The other thing that was really useful for me that I think is applicable to not just university study, but all study. My first year was uncredited. It didn't go towards my final mark. My second and third year scores were average, so they were 50-50 across the 2 years. In my first year, what that meant was that for some people, that lowered the stakes in terms of the amount of work they wanted to do and how far they wanted to push themselves. So that when they got to second year, they were putting a lot of foundational work in that they hadn't done yet. And that meant that there was a bigger spectrum of marks between second and third year, and they didn't get quite as high, perhaps, as they could have if they'd put the graft in first year. I was a massive geek in first year. I was having the time of my life, learning in a new way. Perhaps this goes back to the gap year thing, but I was learning in a new way. I was I was studying literature that at a level that I'd never experienced, with these amazing tutors in this amazing new city. I put so much foundational work in and made mistakes, went for it with essays, tried different styles, learned so much about my own process in year one, even though it wasn't going towards my final grade, that I believe I set a great foundation for second and third year, which meant that actually my second year marks were much higher than they otherwise would have been, because I thought, you know what, even if this doesn't get credited, this is important work right now. If you take the attitude of, you know what, even if this isn't being marked, or even if there's low stakes on this thing, or even if this is a practice essay, I'm going to make an effort, because actually it's more important to lay a foundation or to use this as a learning opportunity, so that when it is being marked or when it does count, I don't have to be doing that work from scratch.
Yeah.
So that applies to so many things. That applies whatever skills you're developing. If you do the work, the earlier you do the work, the better you get. And the more likely it is that when that really counts, you're there already. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, for sure. I think you sort of mentioned an element of taking that opportunity to take a bit of risk and, explore new ways of doing things that perhaps you wouldn't have the confidence to do if your reputation was on the line, so to speak, and it was really counting. Yeah.
Extracurricular stuff at university. So alongside all of that, much geekery, I got involved in, shout out to Newcastle Theatre Society, the wonderful Newcastle University Theatre Society, or NUTS, as it's called. It's beautiful. Who, I gather, are still doing wonderful things. During my time, put on several shows a term, including a musical. And it was through them that I sort of took my performance to the next level. And also then in my third year, I'd done a bit of directing at school. I was able to direct two full productions in my third year, wow, which was just extraordinary. And I got to test that out and work with some really incredibly talented young creatives who were there alongside me, many of whom are working professionally in the roles that they held in the Theatre Society, including me, obviously.
Yeah.
I cast people who are now professional actors doing really, really well. People who are in stage management, who work professionally in stage management. It was absolutely brilliant. So alongside that, in my second year, I became aware that although there was a very strong creative writing contingent within the English department, which is partly why I chose to go there, there was very little in terms of outlet for sharing that work outside of a seminar, outside of class. So I established a regular event called Pints and Poetry. You would not believe how popular this was. We had to move venues in my third year because we just couldn't fit everyone into the small pub we'd started off at. The only other thing I suppose I would mention of significance was, of course, I was doing a lot of singing. I did some musical theatre with the Theatre Society, but also outside of that, most of my singing, aside from sort of singing lessons and a few solo recitals, was that in the Easter and the summer holidays, as you know, Will, I was singing with the National Youth Choir of Great Britain in their main choir, and I was also doing gigs here and there semi-professionally with their chamber choir. So I was keeping that up at the same time.
So how did all that lead to what you ended up coming out of the other side doing?
So when I left university, of course, my plan A, as I told you, was great. I'll re-evaluate when I'm in my third year of university, and I'll decide whether I apply for conservatoire or not. I didn't for two reasons, two-ish reasons, probably a few more holistically, but one being that my singing was being done alongside my directing, my performing in theatre, and my writing, and those three things were sort of going on along on quite equal footing. And I didn't feel that I was ready. I hadn't committed enough to my singing to be ready to audition for postgraduate studies at conservatoire. The other reason was that it was 2010. The recession was pretty bad, and I was terrified about making a living, being out in the wide world. And I was desperate to go out and be a success and do something sensible within the area of what I was interested in. Long story short, I ended up, my first graduate job was as the office administrator of a leading West End producer. I'm incredibly grateful for my time in that job, even though I had the worst time. I'm grateful for that job because I had the worst time, because I figured out so much about what I didn't want to do. And I figured out that it was not worth taking the sensible option if it was going to make me that unhappy. But I also honed really fantastic administrative skills in that time. I was there just under a year before I was able to leave. I was already organised, but actually I learnt a lot of techniques for managing my inbox, for prioritising, that I was able to use practically in a professional setting that I still use today, and I'm so grateful for. It gave me a couple of leads to people I'm still in contact with today and have given me work. I really am grateful for is the right word, I think. Yeah. So during that time, I was pretty miserable, and someone sat me down, someone of a similar age in the company, working in a different area, sat me down and said, why are you doing this out of interest? You're clearly not very happy. And I said, because it was the sensible thing to do. I gave her the short version of my dreams and hopes and things. And she said, well, what would you do if you weren't afraid? If you weren't going for the sensible option, what would you do? And I said in a very small voice, I've always wanted to be an opera singer. And she said, having not heard me, having no knowledge of whether I was experienced or not, whether I had any qualification to be an opera singer, she said, well, why don't you? And I said, I don't know. And I sat there at my desk and I thought, why not? Sadly, it wasn't all glitz and glam and suddenly I was an opera singer. I had to wait. I had to give my notice, leave the job, move back home. And I worked for 2 more years in arts and education administration, including at the offices of my beloved National Youth Choirs of Great Britain, while I started singing again, because I hadn't sung for a year while I was doing this job. I started singing again, having lessons and preparing for auditions. I then auditioned. I got a place. And of course, you get your place 9 months, 10 months before you actually start the course. So I had, I was working essentially for 3 years in arts and education administration. So that's a big part of all of my organizational skills and a lot of the way that I understand my own administration in my freelance career. So then I arrived at the Royal College of Music, age 25, thinking, thank goodness, I know who I am. This is going to make sense of everything. This is perfect. I'm a singer. Great, great, great. And I thought, there's two options here. One is that everything goes brilliantly. I discover, yes, I am good enough. That's great. And I'll go be an opera singer. The other option, which I'm entirely prepared for, is to discover that I'm not quite good enough. And that's okay, because I'm interested in lots of other things as well. Directing, writing, etc. What was so confusing was that during that year, things went pretty well. So I discovered I could, there was a chance, I was informed, and I was feeling in terms of how things were going, then I probably could, I had the ability and the skill to potentially to make a career out of it. I was very, very confused about that not making me very happy.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it wasn't even as clear as it's not making me happy. It was just that something felt not quite right. But during that year, I met a composer with whom I wrote a short opera as part of a project at the Royal College of Music that they still run now every 2 years. So I wrote the text for a 15-minute opera that was performed by the young singers from the opera department at the Royal College of Music, fully directed and staged, alongside 4 other new operas by RCM composers. And somehow, someone on the master's course, a singer on the master's course, came up to me in the canteen one day and said, "You do some directing, don't you?" And I said, "How do you know that? I haven't directed since university." And she said, "Oh, well, someone told me, I can't remember." And I ended up directing just a little show with a community choir and some young conservatoire singers. I did a double bill of Dido and Aeneas and Gilbert and Sullivan's Trial by Jury. It was a very strange double bill.
Those are 2 very different shows. Anyway.
But I tell you what, those 2 projects made me feel more myself, more in control, more able to give of myself, more able to support other people. Because rather than being up there myself and singing and thinking, is that any good? I don't know, blah, 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 being in my own head, thinking all the time, oh, I'm not good enough. I got into that rehearsal room, and having not directed probably since university, I felt like I was in my element. And when I went into the first, not even the performances, but before that, I went into, as you'll know, what we call the Sitzprobe in an opera process, when the orchestra comes in for the first time, or we've just rehearsed with piano, but the orchestra comes in and you hear all the textures that the composers put in. So I'd heard a bit, bits of rehearsal with the piano, and then I sat in the Sitzprobe, and it felt like this composer had reached into my head and just pulled out music that was there. That's the music I would have written for those words. And I just sat and I just cried in the corner. It just makes me emotional thinking about it now.
That's amazing. And
even that rehearsal, let alone the performances, which had me in pieces, that rehearsal was better by 100 times more than getting to the final of a college competition alongside some opera school people when I was a lowly whatever. I was a lowly graduate diploma person, which should have been the pinnacle of my year. And yet it was sitting in that rehearsal room, hearing my text come alive, and at the performances saying, "Good luck, everyone, have a great time," and going out and watching what I had made and the people that I had inspired and the world I had created. And so what happened next was, I was supposed to be doing this year-long course, which was pre-master's foundation year, essentially, for people who hadn't done the undergraduate course, as I hadn't. And if you get a certain mark, you're in to the master's. Fantastic. And I got that mark, and I thought, I still don't know what I want to do. I'll go do the master's. That's fine. I've got a small scholarship. Everything's going great. In the meantime, I got myself a job, an assistant director job with British Youth Opera over the summer, the intervening summer between foundation course and masters. And a week before I was supposed to start that, I woke up and I thought, I don't want to go back to college. I'm not a singer. It's not what I want to do. So I called the head of department. Well, obviously I talked to my parents, who were very confused but supportive. And I called my head of department and I said, "I'm really sorry. I'm not coming back." And a week later, I went into rehearsals with British Youth Opera, And it was the meet and greet. So day one, you had the model, the design model of the design.
What the set's going to look like.
Exactly. Yeah. And you go around the room and you meet everybody, all the creative team, all the cast. And I was shaking hand after hand and saying, "Hi, I'm Laura. I'm the assistant director." And having spent a couple of years shaking hands saying, "Hi, I'm Laura. I'm a singer," and feeling like a fraud, I finally felt like myself.
That's amazing.
And I had nothing in the diary beyond British Youth Opera. And I was lucky enough that one thing led to another, and that led to another assisting job. And I began writing again with this composer and built my freelance career from there.
That's incredible. What would you do if you weren't afraid? I mean, I even though that answer wasn't where you ended up, I just love that question. I think it's so powerful. For anyone that's kind of coming after you in various ways, whether they're thinking of, routes into singing, or perhaps routes into directing itself, or potentially even writing. I'd be fascinated to sort of hear what thoughts you might have, perhaps in the form of what thoughts you might give to yourself if you were able to go back in time and find Laura age 16 and say this is what you want to do, this is how to play it over the next few years.
So I think one thing very connected to, I suppose, an extension of that, what would you do if you weren't afraid, is really thinking about your motivations for making decisions, whether that be taking a job, choosing a course, choosing a module, choosing your subject at A level, making those big choices, what school to go to, what university to go to, whether to move abroad or whatever. I think there are all sorts of reasons not to bring into making those decisions. So I think fear is a big one. Fear is a big one that comes in and hits you around the face, but you have to notice when if you're doing something because you're afraid. I think you also have to bear in mind if you're doing something because someone else wants you to do it, or because you feel pressure either that you've invented or that somebody's put on you to go down a certain path or make a certain decision. A side note on that is that obviously when I made this decision, I mean, I say it's a very quick part of my story now that I made the decision and I left college, but that had come after years of people investing in me, not least my parents, but so many people, particularly when I made the decision to go to conservatoire, and I held fundraising concerts and I reached out for help and advice, and all the people who invested emotionally, financially, logistically in me as a singer, I thought, I'm going to let them down. I'm going to disappoint them. And that was terrifying, really. But what I discovered is that all of those people who invested in me did it because they love me. Whether that be old university tutors who someone's just written me a reference like now for a new application I'm doing, who taught me at my undergrad. People will support you more than you think they will. So don't do anything because you think somebody else wants you to do it or because they're trying to get you to do it. Don't do something because it's the sensible thing. And I suppose the other piece of advice I would give, which I don't think any 16-year-old necessarily might understand when you're like, I wouldn't have understood it when I was 16, and I don't necessarily expect a 16-year-old to understand it, but I would love to plant the seed that you are playing the long game. And it doesn't feel like that when you're at school. It doesn't feel like that when you're at university. It feels like I have to decide now. I have to finish this course. I have to, when I do these 3 years, this thing will be done. I have to do one thing after another, and I have to make all the right decisions all the time. I didn't really comprehend that I was playing the long game until about 2 years into being freelance. And I say that as somebody who accepted many different trajectories along the way and changed course. But you are playing the long game. You don't have to decide now who you are and what you want to do. And that applies whether you're 16 or whether you're 60. And I think if you change your mind or you take a different path because you've learned some new information about yourself or about the world or about reality or about how something feels, whether that's a job or a relationship or a course or a book you're reading, whatever, you are allowed to change your mind, and you're allowed to use everything that you have learned along the way to inform that decision. You know, I go into interviews now and there's still that little voice in my mind that goes, they just think you're a failed singer because you went to conservatoire and you didn't do the masters, you left after a year. And you know what? I am a great director and a great librettist, or on my way to being one. because I trained as a singer for a year, because I understand so much about what it feels like to be a singer, both in terms of lifestyle and emotional content of that kind of work, and also the way that it feels to sing, the way that it feels to perform. And I feel like I am so indebted to that experience. I'm also a better freelancer because I did 3 years in administration. I'm better at what I do because of everything I've learned, and I won't apologize for having taken a different path because it's all been the same path.
Your career is an amazing example of how things coming together, that it feels like a change of direction each point you describe it, English into administration, into music performance, and then into direction. But it's sort of becoming increasingly clear how all these different pieces come together to make the whole that you are now professionally. The thought that came into my own mind as you were talking is there are routes through you can take that are perhaps even more obvious in terms of their optionality. I mean, my own route through academia, for example, was very much guided by, because I was hopeless at making my mind up at each stage. I just thought, well, I'll keep my options open. I'll read science at university because it's a good general degree to have for lots of different sorts of careers. I'll read a bit of business because, again, that's a good general foundation for lots of different sorts of interesting careers. Yours is perhaps an example of slightly less obvious optionality, but fascinating how it all comes together in the end. I'm sure there'll be some people you've inspired to find out more about what you're doing, perhaps even as a private tutor. How can people find you?
So I have a website, which is just www.lauraattridge.com. So just my name, all one word. You can also find information about my my partnership with composer Lewis Murphy, which is all official and stuff. I work with him as well as other composers, but he and I are at www.murphyattridge.com. He's Lewis Murphy, I'm Laura Attridge. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Laura_Attridge. And I'm always up for chatting about what I do and joining the general dialogue about opera and theatre on Twitter.
Laura, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Wonderful stuff. Believe it or not, Laura still also finds time to tutor English literature. And I've no doubt she'd be a phenomenal English tutor if you ever find yourself looking for one. So that wraps up When I Grow Up season, at least for this year. I hope you found all our guests over the summer useful, informative and inspiring, whether you're looking to get into architecture, business, law, or indeed directing operas, as today.
Thanks for listening to the Exam Study Expert Podcast. Remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And please take a moment to write a review for our show in your podcast player.